The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, folks, thank you for joining this AERE presentation on stackable credentials. There's a number of slides here, and we'll get through it. So why don't we start up here? And thank you for all who completed that poll that I had out there. It looks like 1 out of 5 have a stackable credentialing program. So that's not a surprise based upon the work that we do. It is a very low number of our clients that do have any sort of stackable type program. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about who we are and then why are we doing this webinar, and essentially the definition, history, models, and examples and tips and myths of stackable credentials. And then we'll talk about our closing slides in terms of upcoming webinars and a sneak peek into our accreditation standard, the credential quality standard. And then if you have any questions, we'll be able to field them. So a little bit about us. We're almost 5 years old. We turned 5 years old in May. There's a number of us on staff. There's 16 of us. I'm the only owner. We like to be small because we could do things very quickly, and that's why we call it SAF, small, agile, flexible, and meet a lot of your needs in that way. We have a lot of accreditation expertise. In fact, we're going into that business with our new standard soft launching in March. And we have a senior advisory council just in case we hit any gray areas and we want a second opinion. I think some of you may be on the senior advisory council on this call. And we've done a lot of things, and I personally have done almost over 200 job analyses at this point. I do one almost once a month, and almost a standard setting every other month, a passing score study. So there's a lot that we do in terms of psychometrics and exam development. And I'm a lot on the strategy side often, because with a job analysis, if you don't have your strategy in place, it becomes a conversation about strategy when you're there trying to figure out what task and knowledge statements you want to figure out. So just a little bit about me here in terms of where my experiences and education come from. I do have a PhD in educational psychology focusing on measurement and evaluation. I was a clinical psychologist, therapist for a little bit in my life, and I focused a lot on clinical assessments, and that's how I got into measurement as an undergrad. Actually, I'm one of the few people that in the field that started out interested in measurement as more on a psychometric track. I've done a lot in terms of consultation, working with several different test organizations, finding my own businesses in this field, putting standards together. And we're actually getting ready to do some social responsibility with TEDx out of Tyson's and doing their survey experience, their conference experience survey, essentially. So we've been around. We do a lot. We've done a lot of different things, and that's who we are, and that's who I am. So the most interesting thing about this webinar is that this and micro-credentials tend to trend a lot in our industry, in the certification and licensure industry. And in education also, it's trending a little, but education sort of has a history around that, and we'll get into that a little bit. But almost every organization I work with is very interested, or any organization in certification licensure that I've interacted with, we tend to have a conversation on stackable credentials and micro-credentials. And so hopefully this will give you a better understanding, this webinar, of what that really is. So what is it? So the way I look at it, and these are our own definitions that we came up with about 2-3 years ago. So it's really, if you're going through credentials, it's credentials that are organized so that they're looking at certain skills or specific performance levels, advanced, beginner, expert level. And the reason why credentials are in red in these definitions and the S is capitalized is that you really need to have a stackable credentialing model. You really almost need a number of credentials. You can do it with education and build a stack, but that's a little bit more complicated. But for the purposes of this presentation, it's really trying to signify competency in a certain credential, and then you stack various credentials that make up a whole stack, in a sense, a full stack. Again, it goes across certain skills and across performance levels, and we have a lot of visuals to help you out with that definition. There's another sort of way to look at it, a part of a sequence of credentials that can be accumulated over time. And then it's really to help build, one of the major purposes is really to help qualifications to sort of align to how people move in their careers, and it's aligned into their professions and their occupations and jobs. And it actually helps in that way a lot of employers who actually end up wanting folks to have your credential. The AKAs, of stackable credentials are roadmaps and certification paths. I'll show you the roadmap that CompTIA has. Some groups like to call it certification paths. It depends what you want to call it, but a stackable credential, these are just also different ways to call it. At the end of the day, really what you're doing when you're creating a stackable credential is you're really creating your positioning, you're organizing your positioning essentially. So if you all remember Toyota and Lexus and Scions, those sort of products, they're stacked vertically on what people could afford. Scions were really also stacked across an age group, a younger age group, and they were priced at that level and they were built to that level. Toyota's the mid-level, and then if you have more, if you want more luxury, you go for the Lexus. That's really what a stackable credential is doing. You have all these certification products. How can we organize it in a way that meets certain needs and as well as targeted to certain audiences? Here's another example of a BMW. They have different models. They have electrical models. They have the lower series 2 all the way up to the larger 7 series, and they have their SUVs and things like that. Again, this is positioning, and when you start positioning your products, you start realizing, oh, there's different purposes or different audiences and other strategic factors that we'll look into briefly in a moment. There's also, when you're buying any sort of technology, I think this was for a survey system like SurveyMonkey or one of those systems, you could do it for free. You could do it at basic, standard, market research, full access, and you get more and more features. So it's another way to sort of conceptualize what is really positioning within products. And again, a credential is a product. I think a lot of times we tend to forget that. So when I talked about a roadmap or path earlier, this is an early example that I'm sharing with you of what CompTIA does with their quote stackable credential. But you could see they're actually including other certifications in here, Microsoft, GIAC, and other Cisco as well. But they're stacking. We'll talk about this soon, but I'm going to quickly go over it. Is a vertical stack from a lower performance level or performance expectation, beginner, all the way to expert. But then this is your horizontal stack because it goes across different areas. So someone, and this is laid out where this is technically a hybrid or mixed stack model, because you have these horizontals and then you have these verticals in terms of performance levels. And if you wanted to do one or the other, I mean, you can have a CCNA and you can have a CWNA, which is in two different areas, hardware and information security, essentially. So this is a really one way to graphically portray it, and we're going to get through more examples, but this is a quick early example to sort of help you with the definitions that I went through. The history really derives, and this is my own opinion, not that many people talk about the history, but this is a 2010 Department of Labor model of the manufacturing competency model. But they created a stack on what people need to know and do. Some of it is really at the lower end with personality, professionalism, and things like that, and that moves up. This is how they see it, the manufacturing groups. But if you sort of stack credentials along this, you're going to have vertical stacks and you're going to have horizontal stacks as well. And this is sort of where we think this all came from the folks who get into stackable credentials. But this is an early model that if you look up stackable credentials, this is what you'll see. When you get to management and specializations, the stack is higher up in terms of that. And then you have like all these fundamental things of reading, writing, and things like that. So that's another way to look at it in terms of the history, and another example there. So moving on to the next area of the presentation is models. So I sort of alluded to this earlier, but this is a vertical stack which is really across performance levels. Beginner, intermediate, expert, you could have advanced beginner, you could have competent, you could have intermediate, expert, proficient, however you want to label these. It just means that you go from a lower level of competency to a higher level of competency. And you may see this with very early on, like if you use Microsoft's example, this is an associate, and then the experts are the developers and actually the experts, they call it. So on their certifications, but different groups use different names. One of the groups I'm working with right now uses a level 1. I suggested using more of a Microsoft model, associate, developer, expert, move up that way. But they want to use level 1, level 2, level 3, and that's okay. Some groups, it's just that you come out with a fundamental exam, like the former group I worked with. There's a green associate, and then you move up to a specific specialization like building design, and then you move up to expert, which is a fellow program. So what you use in terms of the assessment, we'll get into it. It could be a multiple choice test here. It could just be a reflective items that you have after a course that you take, questions. It could be at this level, maybe a simulation or performance assessment, and then an observation or portfolio assessment where they have to submit a lot of different things, and that's more of a fellow program there. Horizontal stacking is, okay, I want to get into healthcare, and it doesn't really matter the levels at this point, but it's the areas. So you want to learn medical terminology, you want a specialty in that, you want pharmacology, and you want neuroscience, and that's sort of the different stacks. So you can have a healthcare medical terminology certification, a healthcare pharmacology certification, a healthcare neuroscience. Now, if you wanted to mix that up and say you wanted to have beginner, intermediate, expert in those areas, you could. This is IT security itself and programming, C++. So you might want to offer your candidates, well, I want to have 6 certifications. I want 3 at these levels and 3 at these levels. And so you let the candidate or the interested customer pick what they want to do in terms of this. They could sit for the beginner, and then they can make their way up to intermediate, and then maybe they go, oh, you know what, I want to learn C++ now as my programming skill. Or in the former example, you might want to say someone's medical terminology up here, and then pharmacology up here, and they might want to be a beginner here and a beginner, and just have that novice level. Or they could say, oh, you know what, I want to go all the way up to expert level. So that's a mixed hybrid model. Now, we came up with a whole different that mixes up a little bit of what you saw, but it adds a badging component to it. And I think this is one way to use badging, and I think this is a way to distinguish folks across different areas. So let's say you want the performance level to be let's say it's IT security, and they're beginner, intermediate, proficient. That's designated by a certain badge. So 1-star, 2-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, kind of like the military does with their generals. They just have more experiences and things like that, and requirements to get to that when they're promoted. And then the assessment type would be different assessment types. You could use the same assessment type for all of these and make it really difficult, as you go up the stack. But there's different types of assessment types to consider if you really want to move up the badge and things like that. And this is not prescriptive here. Again, you could use multiple choice for all of these and just write really difficult multiple choice questions at the expert level, and then you could write easier multiple choice questions at the beginner level. But this is all up to you how you want to create the assessment type. This is just an example of what you could use. And this is more of a logical progression in the assessment types. Of course, this gets more expensive too as you develop these two types of assessments. So this is a hybrid model where you have the horizontal and the vertical essentially. So you could see that here, the performance level is, this is the vertical. These three are beginners and this is intermediate. This is for IV nursing. So if you were stacking IVs, you would have this here or that here. IV nursing pediatrics, you get one badge because it's a beginner, but you're in pediatrics, so you get a blue for pediatrics, a brown for administration, and green for project management. If you at the intermediate, you get the two badges, and you have management, which is the green, and then you have nursing technology, which is a whole different area, and you have a purple star. So you could see, you could use badging in a very quick way to recognize someone very quickly. If they have a profile, or as they sign out on their email, or if they go on LinkedIn, their designation could be represented by the stars and things like that. So it's a visual model, and you could do any other thing, but this is what we sometimes recommend for groups to do if they're really interested in creating a specialty around this. So before you begin any of this, you should have your strategy in place. A lot of times the strategy works backwards rather than forward, and that's sometimes not the way I would want to do it, but sometimes that's reality. I think a lot of us wouldn't want to work backwards on strategy, but a lot of times we have to adjust our strategy often. But when you do this, if you have some time, I always encourage groups to come and get the name down of your certification. What's the purpose? Because the purpose and audience will start leveling your groups in terms of helping you with the vertical stack, as well as the competency level, eligibility, and then you have your audience and the assessment type. That's going to also help you. These other things, these are just other areas to think about when you get into strategy of your credentialing program, but these gray areas are the areas that you should focus on when you put together your assessments. We were working with a group where we identified that they wanted a mixed stack, so they came up with the name, and they used level 1 and 2, and then they started thinking about the purpose, their first examination, where they want it to be intermediate expert in terms of the competency level. And so they want to stack almost in the middle, and then they want to go right above that later on, expert, and then they want to come down to the lower one, but they also want to stack across different areas as well. So we built in a mixed model for them, and they're executing that now. So it's great. And then sometimes when you have all this in place, it also helps the vendors to say you want to create 3 at once. Well, a lot of vendors, I know we give some discounts when we do 3 at once, and then the resources that you have to use, you can do it all in a week to come up with your job analysis and item writing with the same essential subject matter experts, and doing that model actually fits accreditation requirements and things like that. So there's a quick way to do all this if you have it all. Of course, it's going to cost you more money than having a single credential up front, but if you want to do that, you can do that. And for those that have existing credentials, you could start thinking about, well, what is the real purpose of this credential? What's the audience? What's the assessment type that we're using? Multiple choice or performance assessments, things like that. So this particular slide you could spend a lot of time on, and you should when you're looking and considering a stackable credentialing model and positioning essentially your credentials for your audiences. So let's look at examples now that we have a sense of what this may look like conceptually. So here's the examples. This is coming from ATD, Training and Development Group. We helped them develop this a while ago, and they put the graphics together. We actually began with strategy first, which was great when we created we helped them create the APTD model. And what happened was that they said, oh, you know, we want to stack this, and we helped them with that a little bit more. But they ended up really creating this visual, which I think is really somewhat genius. It's very different from a lot of things that we're used to seeing. But they took all our strategic documents and their own strategic documents and created this. So, you know, this is the highest. If you look at the stack, it stacks from down here, which is all the ongoing education, all the way up to the highest stack, which is your most advanced expert level professional. And then there's the middle one, and then there's beginner ones here. And so that's how their credentials stack. They have really 2 essential credentials, and then they have certificates over here and here as well. But, you know, they put their eligibility criteria in terms of years of experience over here, so they're mapping that out as well. And then throughout it, they could always take courses, this ongoing education, which is in some ways a horizontal stack in some ways, but it's not an official credential, but it's an education. And that's how you mix the education with your stackable credential model. You could fit them all in there, essentially. So I thought this was a really great way of visualizing it for their needs. This is Microsoft's. Unfortunately, you know, this is the best I could get from the web in terms of what this is. Theirs is a little, they've changed theirs, I think, last year or 2 years ago, but this is your associates before you earn an expert or developer. You have to earn associates. So this is how it stacks. The IT groups like to do it like with these subway lines, I call them. So that's how I like to visualize it. But they go horizontally when it's really a vertical stack from easy to hard, you know, hard or advanced or expert level. And there's different legibility criteria to get to MSCE and things like that. But the really neat thing is that the horizontal stack is by actually client server productivity database development, and then they have Azure as their cloud stack here. So it's an interesting model to look at. This is sort of all their the developer and expert level. E is expert, developers D, but they're considered expert certifications. In order to earn them, you have to get, so this is their vertical stack, you have to get an associate, and then you have to another exam from a list of electives. And this is sort of how they keep their and so when you're thinking about your recertification model or your maintenance of competency, your stack can come into play as well, because you could offer them, you know, they have to do this every year. They have to year renewed, so they have to do this exam, then take a different one, or have the MSCE and then take a different one to maintain it. So, you know, how they work it though is initially you have to take 2 exams to earn the associates. Then you have to have the associates plus the elective exam to earn the expert or developer. So that's their expert level. And then if you want to maintain the expert or developer level, you have to take a different elective or retake the exam, and then it's renewed. So that's how they incorporate the maintenance of competency recertification model with the stacks. So that's something that you all can consider too. This is a certification program I worked on before I got into my own organization. But this is the easiest of them, the lead green associate, and then you have different specialties, really, operations, maintenance, building design, and construction. So they have this, and then they have a fellow program here, which is the creme of the creme of those individuals who have an AP designation already. So that's a vertical stack. They also have something that is horizontal, which I didn't put in here, which is the Green Classroom Professional Certificate Program that I also helped initially launch and design. And actually, that was actually a gamification system in the beginning, and then I had left and they dropped that one, the gamification piece. There's different stacks as well you could look at on your own. Cisco has a way to earning it through a BS degree, network engineering. Digital Promise has micro-credentials in there. One of the things I want to say about micro-credentials, this is not on micro-credentials, but I want to say this, that micro-credentials still, you could develop a micro-credential that's not technically an examination, which uses just reflective items after you know, you give them some sort of courseware, and those are reflective items to see if they understand the information or not. And you could give them a designation. Does that mean that's going to meet validity and and reliability and fairness standards? Probably not, because you're asking maybe 10 total questions, but you can write questions to, you know, the best practices on how to write questions and items and things like that. But you could have a, you know, you can have a credential like that, but you probably won't be able to get accredited because you don't have enough items. And things like that. So micro doesn't mean that you have less items. You need a certain amount of items to establish your validity and reliability. So we have those conversations a lot just to save anyone time if they're wondering if they can have a 5-item examination, and you typically cannot. I have not seen that go well in this field of credentialing examinations. Learning Tree is probably one of the oldest IT groups, education IT groups out there. They've been stacking credentials in that subway model for, I don't know, 30, 40 years now. But they've been around doing it in terms of their courseware and their examinations. But they began as courseware in the very beginning, because I know I almost took a few of their courses many years ago. So they do have a certification in some IT areas. Project Management Institute, you know, they have the beginner and practitioner levels. So, you know, they began with the PMP, but I think they have an associate's PMP certification, so that's a little lower. So they're beginning to stack as well. They all have a horizontal stack with the Agile certification. And then this last group, they have a vertical stack. And you could look this all up. We're recording this webinar, so you could go back and look this all up and investigate it yourselves. A lot of groups just don't call it a stackable credential on their website. They usually call it a certification path or roadmap, essentially. So if you look up a stackable credential, you're not going to find groups that had that off of Google. You're going to have to look up roadways or pathways or things like roadmaps and things like that. So this is the stackable badging models, which I think is really helpful. This is what it looks like in practice. You know, this is a vertical stacked badging model where you're going fundamentals, associate, expert. You could see 3-star has the expertise, 2-star has the associate, 1-star has the fundamentals. They even give you more information, Microsoft, of, you know, where you would be starting in technology. 2 years, 2 to 5 years are the areas that you could look at. And so that's one way to do it with the badging. This has a mixed badge in the Armed Defense Training Association. So if you earn something in safe shooter, you get a gold star, or defensive shooter. So these would be your horizontals, range officer, safety officer. This might be a vertical because now you're above it, so now you can instruct people on safe shooting and defensive. I would actually change that to a different color star like they do for their board members. The board members might be a different type of stack. So it's something to consider. It's just another conceptualization. This is actually in training rather than a certification. But if you offered certifications in these 3 areas, or if there's a certification for board members, you can do that as well. This is another sort of a stack where, you know, you could see the empty ones. So this might be your fundamentals, this might be your intermediate, and this might be your expert again. So whatever you designate it, it could be that as well in terms of a vertical stack. You could also change this to yellow, and then they earn something maybe for blue, which is a specialization in this, and then maybe, you know, making this green, and that might be a different specialization. So that'd be a horizontal stack there. But if you use all yellows, you can make it a vertical, however you want to portray that, that's up to you. So there's a few things before you do this. There's tips and myths. So again, the strategy we went over in that one area, but you really want to focus a lot of your attention on all your certifications or credential offerings, on the purpose and scope of them. What's their performance levels? What's their target audience? What's their intended purpose? How do they affect worker outcomes and organizational outcomes, perhaps? Again, you want to determine their purchase cycle and intent early on if you can, and who would take this at the expert level. A lot of times I have a lot of clients that want to start at the expert level, but guess how big that audience is, or that it's not that big. It's less than going down the stack. So you might have a beginner one, but you could create an awareness one, which is even lower, and you could open up your audience a lot more, and get a lot more volume and buzz around those sort of things. I always suggest that if you want to start out with any credential, you might want to start it with a vertical stack. It's just easier for buy-in and for folks to understand. It just makes it easier. There's nothing wrong with doing a vertical and horizontal stack at the same time, or just a horizontal stack. But vertical stacks are easy because it's just beginner, intermediate, expert. You also want to think about the type of assessment you're going to use. The most common and the most affordable is multiple choice questions, and it's easy for the accreditation bodies and your psychometricians to handle for accreditation and things like that. So it's more affordable than creating a very complicated simulated, or create stations where you have to demonstrate something and bring in judges and train the judges, calibrate the judges. Performance-based assessments tend to take more time to develop. They tend to be more costly because there are more resources on a group like us. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. And then there's portfolio assessments and things like that. So your type of assessment is one area. And then if you go to the awareness, you might just want to create like a very certification that's, that just has reflection items, and be very upfront about it, that, it's just a reflection item. Its intention is just to do awareness. It doesn't really have any repercussions on employability or anything like that, versus like a real certification that should meet all the standards and things like that. Success metrics and retirement and credential metrics, you might create like 5 really high-end, really high-level specialty examinations. If you're only getting one person every 3 years, why are you keeping it? There could be good reasons, because it's mission-driven. There could be an argument somehow that your data scientists have shown that if you have really high aspirational ones, it helps people move up the stack. So you're getting more people in there. It's hard to measure, but it is doable. If you talk to a data scientist, they usually can figure these things out, or a research person with good stats behind them. So marketing is also, you want to make sure that folks understand that this pathway is logical. So you want to probably create some informal conversations or formal focus groups, all the way to formal focus groups. So like, if we created this type of stack, would more people come and understand it and buy it, and you get a better purchase intentions around it. So, and also communicating it. You may want to launch something, you have a brand new program, you want to launch this at the intermediate level, and then in a year later you're going to have the one that goes below it, and then a year later you're going to have one that goes at the expert level. So again, the visuals are really helpful when you do this, and then when you do a stackable credential, you might want to do bundled pricing. So sign up now, and over the course of 3 years we'll sign you up for all this courseware and all the certifications for this dollar amount. And have a discount around it as well, which most of you probably do. So again, you also want to show how the value around a stackable credential. So if someone earns this lower level, they're going to make this amount of money, and they're going to, for the candidate, and then they're going to be this type of independence. They're going to reduce waste, become more cost effective, those sort of things that you want to sort of do. And then you could consistently upsell and cross-sell this product. It's very, very intuitive to do that. And then the business decisions, this is not all the tips, but these are some tips that we have. Like I said earlier, you might want to stack at the awareness level. If you're at the beginner or intermediate, you want to stack lower because your audience is going to be larger in most cases. Some of you are specialty groups, so you really can't do that because your competition's there, but that doesn't mean you may want to compete with their awareness because they don't have the awareness one out there. So whatever your arrangements are, you might want to consider that. Again, there's costs to do a number of these and to maintain them and time. So that's why it's multiple credentials, a stackable model. And if you're trying to develop them all at the same time, there are savings in the long run, but recovering your costs and things like that for the expert ones are more difficult. So just consider all those things when you do that. And most, like I said, I'm not talking for all vendors, but most vendors, when we're developing examinations, we do give discounts for doing multiple credentials at the same time. And then you could plan it out where, you're only using your resources, instead of bringing in new subject matter experts, you could use the same subject matter experts for a number of these typically in terms of, your job analysis, doing that 5 days versus 2 days for each of them. You could do 3 of them in 5 days and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And then consider other products related to the credentials is important. Exam preparation, so you can link that back up again. And then bundling these things is just really great if you could do that and make it attractive for folks. And I think that could really work. I mean, obviously they have to pass it, but if they fail it, they might have to pay something for it because they contracted with you on that. I don't know where the fairness is on that, but you'll have to decide that. So the myths. So there's really no standards around a stackable credentialing model. There are credentials around the credential. There's standards around the credential itself. So just some groups have asked me like, well, does a stackable credential model meet a standard? I was like, there's no standards for a stackable credential. I'm not sure how that would even look. It's not a credential itself, a stackable model. It uses credentials to create the model. It can cost a lot of money, but if you already have certifications in your program, you could begin to stack the model right now. Talk about the strategy and things like that, and how you're going to stack it. I know a lot of groups consistently do this with their existing examinations, but they don't really call it a stackable credential. Those that already created something like that, you saw the roadmaps and the certification pathways. Sometimes they call it that. It depends how you position it. I would look in positioning across different other products, like I showed you earlier with cars and survey systems. And the stackable credentialing model, again, it doesn't relate to anything in an accreditation standard, but the credential itself does. So you can't credential on, most of the credentialing organizations, they credential on a specific credential. They credit on a specific credential, I should say. So you can't do the whole thing. You have to do each one separately in terms of how the accreditation bodies do it, ANSI and NCCA and others, including ourselves, AERE here. So in closing, what I'd like to ask you is if you have any suggestions. Some of you have a stackable credential model. I'd be curious of what that looks like. If you want to send it our way, we'll keep it confidential. If you need us to, just let us know. We like to compile this information and maybe put it out there if we have a lot of good things. And if you have any advice, tips, or anything like that, just let us know as well. We're also learning this. This is kind of trending over the past few years. I started in the last decade, and the end of the last decade, it was really trending, and it's a conversation I have with most folks, which is really good because it supports your marketing and communications plan. So the upcoming presentations, I wish it could be like, this is portraying Freud and his patient. Sometimes I wish I was like this all the time, just talking to Freud, but fortunately I don't have that. But that was a presentation I gave at EATP a few years ago. But our upcoming presentations is, they are coming up March 14th is the job analysis for the workforce, a competency model. More and more of you clients and potential folks in the field want to develop a job analysis, not necessarily for the examination, but the workforce as well. And you could actually, like I said, a competency model actually begins your stacking. So if you do a competency model that gets all those levels, it begins to do that. So these two topics are really related in some ways. And then if you're going to the Innovations in Testing Conference, ATP, in San Diego, I'm doing a number of presentations there. One's on performance assessments and gamification, one's on job analysis, and then this was a really fun study. It did take us a lot of time. Jennifer Naughton and I worked with a group out there, CFA actually, because we're presenting on this with them, on evaluating the quality of high-stakes certification program against other programs. So we actually looked at all these metrics and areas to look at, and we evaluated it both on the psychometric side and the programmatic side of things, and it was really interesting, the findings, and how one group compares to 4 or 5 other groups out there, and it was great that the groups that were involved with us, the other certification programs, that they really helped us and volunteered information about their programs. And then on July 16th, we're going to have another webinar. We have a lot of conversations on pass rates. Almost every time I sit with a group, I feel like I'm talking about pass rates. Even like last week, I was at a job analysis meeting, and we're talking about pass rates. And it's interesting to the difficulty of having comfort with pass rates, selecting, adjusting, and then living with your pass rates. That's the hard part, because there's a science to get to a cut score that affects your pass rates. So we'll talk more about that. If you want to learn more about stackable credentials, one way you could do this is go to our website. We have one-pagers and multi-pagers, and we also have a blog on stackable credentials. They're all available through our website and our AERE WordPress blog. And then presentations, we actually have a recorded presentation already that I did with Liberty Munson and Jennifer Naughton, and they talk a little bit more about, Jennifer talks about ATD, and Liberty talks about Microsoft on their stackable models. And so those are some resources that we have. We do this a lot with groups on helping them develop their stackable credentialing framework and strategy. So one of the things that we want to leave you with is really just a very, very brief sneak peek into our accreditation program that launches next month, essentially. But there's ANSI and there's NCCA. This is very different in many ways, but very similar, that we still are looking at the psychometrics and operations and programmatic components of your credentialing program. The difference is that, one, it's more affordable. I think we looked at having the price of it. It's resource sensitive, meaning that because it's prescriptive and track based, prescriptive is that we ask you if you meet a prescriptive standard, rather than ANSI saying in one of their standards that you have to be reliable, fair, and valid. We go through the entire life cycle and psychometrics on this one, and we look at whether something meets this criteria. Like you have to have a number of subject matter experts. Do you meet that? Yes or no? And everything's a yes, no. So it's a question-based standard where we ask you. It looks like the standard's linked right to the application itself. So that's that piece of it. And the other way, it's resource sensitive, where you're not using dedication as meant people or time, is that you have tracks. So we have a person, and we have 2 groups in the pilot. One of them are doing both tracks, and one of them just doing operations for their micro-credentials. So it does fit micro-credentials. So it's up to you what you want to credit. You want to do operations, you want to do psychometrics, and we're going to come out with an education piece to it. to support certificate programs and an exam preparation piece as well in the next few months. It's also one of the things that we do. We don't think we know everything. I know most of us don't, else we would be narcissists, but we do have exceptions. So if you have enough proof to show us that you are meeting the standard, and there might be this sort of practice that's, peers have agreed with, or, a peer-reviewed journal that says, you're doing a job analysis this way, and you submit that with your report, we would accept that. Our assessors would accept that. So we are okay with exceptions. So every standard comes with yes, no, or exceptions. When you file for exceptions, we may have to review it, and if it takes more time, we do charge you for that. And then the other piece of it is educative. We don't want the standards to be punitive. We want you to be able to overcome these standards, so any of the assessors can recuse themselves and become your consultant. AERE can become your consultant as well. To get over these standards. We also will help you as much as possible with examples and things like that, so you can get through this. We just want you to succeed and have a program that's following some level of standardized things. Now, we're not as comprehensive, because resource sensitive, we're not as comprehensive as ANSI and CCA, but we hit the big pieces of what we think is this. And it was developed by folks on both the operations program side as well as the psychometric side as well. So if you're interested, reach out to me. And you could always reach out to me using this site, and you can make AEREexperts.com consultation. You can make an appointment. You can look at my calendar, see how busy I am, and you click on one of these things, and it gives you my phone number, and you have an appointment with me. You can always call me directly too, or email me for anything. So I could take questions in the chat box if anyone has questions. Otherwise, I want to thank you for your time today, and we'll also have this recording provided definitely on our website, maybe earlier than that, because we put them on YouTube as well. So we'll have that as well. So I'm not sure if there's any questions at this point. Yeah. How are the someone asked me how were the accreditation standards developed. They were developed using resources that we had, evidence-based articles, journals, existing standards, and we worked with a very small group of senior psychometricians on the psychometric side and senior folks in the field on the programmatic side. Again, one way to look at it, it's a lighter version, but it still meets the minimal requirements of psychometrics and operations. So there's a few more questions here. Let me just... one second here. All right. So my question thing disappeared somewhere. So let me see if I can find it again.